My name is Richard Sapp. I am the DIY Realtor. Today we are building a fence. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is get rid of this old dilapidated fence. It's been there for decades, frankly, and wasn't even cemented in, so surprised it was even still standing. First thing we want to do is run our string line. This is where the fence is going to go. It's also where the posts are going to butt up against. So you want to put these stakes slightly past where your first and last post are going to go, and it's a pretty simple process. Involves hammering a couple of sticks or stakes into the ground and then pulling the string as tight as possible. You don't want anything impeding it. You don't want it resting on roots or branches or the ground or anything. So it doesn't have to be perfectly level, but you can try to make it as level as possible. But tight and straight is really what you're looking for here. So the next step will be dig your post holes. We are going 2 feet down for a 6-foot privacy fence. So these posts are 8 feet in length, and you're going to dig the post holes directly behind or in front of the string line, and you really want the back of the posts to come as close to the string or touch the string if possible. And really, as long as you're consistent, whether your post is an inch off or an eighth of an inch off, as long as your posts are consistent, it will be flush when you're completely done. But this is a very important step, and I'm just setting the posts in there to make sure everything is going to be lined up correctly. They are 8 feet apart, and you can see this is how flush the post is against that stake. So the first thing we'll do after getting the post in the ground is we want to attach some braces. This is so that when we get them level, they don't move. And the last thing that we want to have happen is we bump this with a 2x4, or we walk away and a rainstorm comes and it shifts it out of balance and out of being level. And you can argue with me if you want, but the next couple of steps I feel like are interchangeable. If you want to pour the concrete first or you want to set the braces first, it really doesn't matter because you're going to continuously look at it to make sure that it's level. But once I've got my braces attached, then I'm just pouring in some dry concrete here. Quickcrete, it settles in 20 to 40 minutes, and the instructions say you can dry pour it. Here in Florida, we get tons and tons of rain and tons of moisture, so I really didn't care how much water I was putting in it. In fact, you'll see there's a rainstorm that happens here later, so I know for a fact that this concrete is going to get completely soaking wet. I've actually seen people just dry pour it and leave it without even putting water in because they are so confident that the groundwater and the water within the ground is going to solidify it. Don't really recommend that, especially because I want this post to settle and be firm as quickly as possible. So I didn't measure the water, just kind of pouring some on, but because I made a mess, I'm just tucking it in. You want the concrete to be 2 to 4 inches below your ground level. You really don't want concrete protruding from the top, or what's going to be above your sod or your dirt, whatever it is. So it's important to make sure that it's 2 to 4 inches below the ground, and then hitting it with a stick or stake or shovel or something to make sure there's no air pockets in there is a good idea. And then obviously triple checking to make sure that this thing is level on both sides. This is the poor man's post level. You can actually buy a post level that attaches to it. I didn't have one. I just had 2 3-foot levels, which worked just fine when you hold them up against each other. But after we attach the braces, now I'm attaching some stakes to them to make sure that this thing doesn't go anywhere. Again, this is a crucial step, and I do not recommend skipping it. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but it is important to make sure everything stays perfectly level. So I'm just fixing up the ground, putting the dirt back where it belongs, because we are actually going to be measuring from the ground up for our rails, and so it's really important that we prep the ground and make sure that it's going to be that each post is equal, because if you're measuring from the ground up but your ground isn't level, then it will throw your rails off potentially. And this is kind of what it looks like after it's all said and done. This is about 1/8 of an inch off of that line that post is, and that's what the braces look like. But after you've done your first post, you'll want to go to the very end or the last post that you have and set it next. And this is to ensure that all of your posts in the middle of your fence line up with these two. If you use these two as a guide, then all the ones in the middle should line up perfectly. But if you decide to go one at a time down the line, then you could be going in a direction that you don't want to, and by the end, even though everything is perfectly plumb and straight, it might be 1 inch, 2 inches, a foot off, depending on how long your fence is going to be. So we're just double checking here. You can see the string is nice and tight. The first post and second post are in, and they are perfectly in line with each other. So after this, it's going to be just rinse and repeat. Make sure all of the other posts are perfectly plumb and in line with the string. Since the concrete sets in about 20 to 40 minutes, I was able to only need two sets of really two sets of braces, because I could pull one off and attach it to the next one by the time it was dry. So again, just same thing over again. And these posts are 8 feet to center. We are measuring for the rails. This is 9.5 inches from the ground up. That's where your bottom rail is going to go. And this doesn't need to be exact, right? As long as it's consistent across your posts, then your rails will look uniform. But if you start getting crazy, then they won't line up and they won't match. And most of my ground is level and flat, but there is a slight incline to it. So again, as long as you're measuring from the ground up and you are consistent with that, then your slope doesn't matter, and your rails will follow the natural slope of your yard, and so will the pickets. And so your fence and your pickets will run with the slope of the yard as long as you're measuring from the ground up. So we measure from the ground up 9.5 inches for the bottom rail, and then 5 feet 8 inches for the top rail. And the 2x4s for the rails are going to sit below that line. We don't want more than 4 to 6 inches from the top of the pickets to the rails, just for looks, as well as for holding on. If you get somebody that grabs the top of it and there's not much support at the top, it could just pull the pickets right off. So 9.5 inches from the bottom for the bottom rail, and 5 feet 8 inches from the bottom for the top rail. And then the middle, all that we're going to do is measure halfway in between that and on each side, and that's where the middle post will be, and it'll be perfectly in the middle. I'm attaching a screw to the post because I'm doing this by myself, and that screw is, I don't know, 4.5 inches below where my line is, so that it doesn't really matter. All I'm doing is putting the screw up there so it'll hold the rail until I get it secured. Now, I mentioned that these posts are 8 feet apart, and it's really important to leave about 2 inches on either side so that your next rail can sit flush with it and be right next to it. And your next rail is simply going to start where the other one ended, and then you're going to go to the 9.5 inch line. These rails extend slightly past my posts on either side, and that is because I frankly just couldn't get the posts any deeper. On one side there's significant bamboo roots, and the other side is a footer for that cement wall, so I couldn't put the posts exactly where I wanted them to be, so the rails needed to extend off about a foot. And that's why you see them doing that. You also have to account for the pickets in the rail. So I'm taking the good neighbor side, and my neighbor knows it. But because the rails and the picket will add about 6 inches from from the post, you'll want to make sure that you're accounting for that on either side of what you're doing. This jig that I made is simply a 2x4. Backing up, that jig that you saw is simply a 2x4 with a little header on top that's 4 inches above the 2x4, and as long as I continue to use that, my fence posts, or my pickets rather, will be level. Even though I'm using this and that picket is level, it's really important that you go back to make sure that each one is level. I say each one, every 3 or 4 pickets that you put up, you'll just want to double check with the level. So that's really, as you can see in my hand there, I secured a 2x2 to it simply because I didn't have a big enough 2x4. Otherwise, it would just be one gigantic piece. So you can see that there. It's nothing special, but it's basically to serve as a spacer of 4 inches between each picket. And then as long as my rails are set correctly, I know that I can just go directly to the top of that, and they're all going to be perfectly level. Your rails don't have to be level, and again, if your ground is sloped or inclined in any way, they're not going to be level because they have to follow the terrain, and you don't want them to be. But as long as you're, let's say, 4 inches from the top, regardless of which direction your rails are going, the pickets are going to be level and straight with each other. Now I have about 41 to 42 feet here, and I used 105 rails exactly. I got really lucky in that they all lined up and measured perfectly. However, you might need to do a little bit more specifications to make sure that everything comes out well. Now, for the middle picket that is creating the privacy effect, I simply stuck it in the middle and then made sure that it was level. I didn't measure it, to be sure that it was exactly 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches from the other picket, because frankly, no one's going to know, no one's going to be able to tell if you're an inch or so in either direction for all of these. Really what you want is get it in the middle and then make sure that it's level, because otherwise it's going to look silly. And you absolutely want pressure treated wood for this. You also don't want your pickets touching the ground. So you need them about 2 inches off of the ground, because you don't want them to come in contact for rot, insect purposes, and whatnot. And that's it, folks. This is the final product. I think it came out really well. It's perfectly straight, it's level, and it really wasn't that difficult. It took me about an afternoon or so. Look forward to being a resource. Reach out anytime.